You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to HorrorBabble. Peter Van Melsen returns today in The Translucents. Our PI visits the coastal town of Southport in order to investigate the alleged presence of doppelgangers in a sizable antique center. See the video description below for a link to the Van Melsen playlist. You'll also find links to the first Van Melsen ebook collection. Artwork by yours truly. We hope you enjoy this one, folks. The Translucents by Ian Gordon. The following account is taken from Peter Van Melsen's 2018 memoir, In Search of the Occult. An abridged version of the article, What is a Doppelganger?, was published in the February 14th, 2011 edition of the British magazine Fortean Weekly. Foreword. The tea's on, cigarettes are plentiful. It's a cool but pleasant day here in Rosedale. Time to do some writing. What can I say about this one? I'm sure Mike will be happy enough with it, despite its floundering nature. What a day that was. I'm still reeling from it, truth be told. To think that I went over there with such confidence, such unwavering certainty. How pig-headed of me. But once again it seems that my involvement was unavoidable. And now I'm left with a tough decision. Take the necessary steps to close the book, or put the whole thing on the shelf. My only concern is that if I opt for the latter, I'll be haunted by what I see in the mirror for the rest of my life. Can I endure that? Well, I've endured worse, I suppose. There are darker dreams, nastier nightmares. Ah, well, I'd better get it down. I might have more to say afterwards. What is a Doppelganger? By Peter Van Melsen, P.I. What, I ask, is a doppelganger? Is it merely the apparition of a living person, the so-called spirit double we've discussed many a time on these pages, or is it something more, something as of yet beyond our fumbling attempts to explain? Some might say the former is an example of the latter. I, on the other hand, despite recent events, remain undecided on the subject. Instead of going over the same old repetitive ground, allow me, if you will, to tell a tale concerning a most extraordinary afternoon. Northern readers, particularly those in the counties of Merseyside and Lancashire, will know what it's like to spend an afternoon in the pleasant coastal town of Southport. You might enjoy a stroll through Prince's Park, or a windswept wander along its lengthy 19th-century pier in search of the elusive Irish Sea. Perhaps a spot of shopping in the town centre, weaving in and out of its numerous water features and gardens, seeking shelter below the beautiful Victorian canopies of Lord Street. At the south end of this attractive boulevard lies the Royal Arcade, a maze of interconnected chambers and passageways, host to a vast assortment of independent vendors, sellers of antiques and rare collectibles. But what has all this got to do with doppelgangers? I hear you asking. I'm simply setting the scene, dear reader. Last month, January 6th, I think it was, I received a letter from a Royal Arcade vendor. In the telling of this tale, the vendor would like to remain anonymous, so I'll refer to her as Linda. Linda, an avid reader of F.W., had taken it upon herself to contact yours truly concerning a spate of unusual occurrences at the precinct. According to her letter, a number of her colleagues for a time had fallen out of favour with her, owing to what they described as out-of-character behaviour on her part. Following her supposed departure on certain evenings, Linda would be seen in other parts of the arcade, sifting through the wares of fellow vendors, ignoring their attempts to interact with her. She was cold and brash, they said, not at all like the happy-go-lucky trader they knew. Naturally, she'd insisted that it wasn't her they'd observed, that she'd been at home when such encounters had taken place. And still, the unusual occurrences continued. Sightings of other vendors ostensibly retired for the day, all of whom were perceived in a similar fashion, sullen and impolite, seemingly obsessed with the pursuit of something evasive among the myriad stalls of the arcade. Understandably concerned, a handful of vendors, Linda included, decided to remain in the arcade after hours one evening, with a view to accosting one of these questing doubles. And though there were indeed sightings of mysterious twins, the shadowy figures were consistently able to slip away undetected, rounding corners to oblivion, descending stairs to the abyss. Doppelgangers in Southport? I simply had to investigate. I arrived in the seaside town the following Monday, January 10th. It was bitterly cold that afternoon, not untypical given the time of year, but the chill added an air of unease to proceedings. On leaving the train station, I went directly to Lord Street via London Street, and heading south, soon caught sight of the Royal Arcade. The Victorian structure that houses the precinct is rather distinctive. A great sandstone facade in classical style meets the eye, below which an impressive 5-bay veranda of cast iron and glass plays host to the words Royal Arcade in bold, cherry lettering. Stepping beneath this veranda, one encounters the entrance proper, where once again the words Royal Arcade serve as an invitation to the warren of wares beyond. I strolled inside, not pausing to study the plethora of items glaring at me from the cluttered comfort of numerous window displays. The din of Lord Street faded away, and I found myself confronted by a well-stocked entrance hall, lined with row after row of tall glass cabinets, host to assorted bric-a-brac. The odd shopper went about their business here and there, but my overall impression was that it was a quiet day for the arcade, which I thought would serve me well in my investigations. My contact, Linda, had arranged to meet me in the cafe on the first floor, and so I made my way upstairs. And it was at the bottom of the stairs that I caught my first glimpse of something strange. Perhaps it was just my imagination, I mused, fueled by the purpose of my visit. But mounting the staircase above me, little more than a dozen strides ahead, was a tall gentleman in a dark coat who bore a striking resemblance to myself. The gait of this fellow, briefly seen though it was uncannily familiar. The overcoat, long and black, was exactly like the one I myself was wearing, and his head sported greying hair pushed back in a style all too similar to my own. But this mysterious individual was up and away before I could examine him further, and when I finally mounted the stairs, the man had disappeared entirely. In fact, there was nobody else to be seen on the upper level, just tables, shelves, and cabinets filling a large room, from which at least 5 archways led to additional spaces. One of these was the cafe, so I went there directly, brushing off for the nonce the sighting of my look-alike. Linda was waiting for me in the cafe, sitting alone in a corner of the room, her arms outstretched, drumming the table with noticeably swollen fingertips. A pot of what I sensed was cold tea sat in front of her, an untouched cup of the beverage looking sad and stagnant next to it. I introduced myself, and insisted on acquiring for our chat a fresh pot of English breakfast. We were the only patrons, and as such service was prompt. Soon enough we were engaged in conversation, and I heard the story from Linda once more, crowned as it was with the details of her latest encounter. "I saw it last night," she stammered. "It was down in music. Music, referring to the music memorabilia section on the ground floor. "Yes," I prompted. Although we were closed, I figured it was a shopper making their way out. "But it wasn't," I stated. "No," she said, her bottom lip trembling. "It was a lady, similar in build to myself, wearing exactly what I was wearing. She gave me the creeps, but knowing what had been going on, I followed her anyway. I wanted to get a good look at her." Linda gripped the cup of tea I'd poured for her, but I could tell she wasn't about to drink it. "I was coming up behind her," she continued, "just a few steps away, when she hopped to one side and ducked into a cramped aisle." Linda paused again. "And then I got a look at her face. It was just blank, like the face of a mannequin, an almost transparent face with nothing underneath. I gave up after seeing that. That was enough for me." I nodded reassuringly. "What do you think?" she asked, tentatively. As a reader of Fortean Weekly, I imagine you're familiar with the idea of a doppelganger." Linda nodded slowly. "Good," I said. "It's impossible to observe your double directly, which might explain the translucent face you saw. Others, however, wouldn't know the difference, and as such would perceive the doppelganger as you, which, of course, is how all this started, is it not?" Again, Linda nodded, a look of reluctant comprehension on her face. "What does it want?" she asked pleadingly. "That's what I've come to get to the bottom of," I stated, taking a much-needed sip from the cup in front of me. It's unnecessary to type out the rest of our conversation. Suffice it to say that I asked Linda to keep the details of our discussion to herself, and to vacate the premises for the remainder of the day. Her presence, I felt, would only complicate matters. And so, it seemed to my mind that my investigations would begin in the music memorabilia section, but not before a stroll through the web of the first floor, wherein an itch of my own might be scratched. At the beginning of this account, I asked a simple question. What is a doppelganger? Well, to get closer to the answer, one should probably ask, what is the purpose of a doppelganger? And, as Linda suitably asked, what does it want? Having seen the man at the top of the stairs, the fellow who appeared to resemble myself, I was reminded of something I'd once read in Arthur Baker's Thief. I don't like to quote from such books too often, but the following excerpt, found in a chapter concerning shapeshifters and other entities, seemed eerily relevant to my experience. It's a verse titled, "The Man Who Followed Himself." Up the stairs he idly went, step by step he climbed, until at last he came again, and purpose filled his mind. The verse can be interpreted in a number of ways, but by my reckoning, it infers that certain beings can only exist under certain circumstances, that the presence of one, if the conditions are just right, might rouse another. Had my coming to the Royal Arcade awakened a doppelganger of my own? If so, how might such a happening relate to Linda's doppelganger and the other doubles roaming the precinct? I left the cafe and returned to the room with the 5 arches. Although there were a few shoppers milling about now, laying their hands on various items with casual indifference, it was still, for the most part, quiet. I'll dispense with trying to provide an accurate account of my route through the maze, and just say that I went on a non-linear journey through dozens of corridors and rooms, each as overflowing as the last with all manner of curiosities. I was following my nose, allowing my instincts to guide me, through a room of colourful globes and a recess of feline figurines, a corridor of tribal busts, and a nook of comic books. I was on the trail of something elusive, but somehow I felt that I was gaining on it, whatever it was. At last, I caught sight again of the tall man in the dark coat. He was approaching an arch labelled Rugs, beyond which I could see a number of distinctive Afghans on display. He entered the large chamber, and I followed. I crossed the threshold and stepped into another world. Not literally, I might add, but the pervasive smell of old wool and the organic whiff of bleeding dye served to transport me elsewhere. I gazed at the striking carpets, some held by huge swinging arms, others affixed to the walls like tapestries. But just as before, my double had thwarted me. He was nowhere to be seen. And then it occurred to me, what if this figure, this apparition, for want of a better word, was but a distraction? I considered the second part of the man who followed himself. On he strode with great aplomb, his flame it burned anew. Insensible of the true design, he must exist as two. Insensible of the true design. This was the key. If it hadn't been for Arthur Baker, I might have spent the rest of eternity roaming the halls of the Royal Arcade. It was time to give up the chase and head downstairs in quest of the thing responsible for the appearance of my curious double. Retracing my steps through the interminable passages of the first floor was no mean feat, but I eventually managed it, finding myself once more in the entrance hall. From there, I followed a series of strategically placed arrows and located the sought-after music memorabilia section. This was an absurdly cluttered chamber, filled from floor to ceiling with magazines, vinyl records, cassette tapes, posters in tattered frames, and a huge variety of musical instruments, including battered classical guitars, stringless violins, unpolished saxophones, and honky-tonk pianos. A young man sat at one of the latter, seemingly delighted by the cacophony of sound he was producing. Up and down the aisles of the chamber I strolled, looking for anything out of the ordinary, which was easier said than done in such a place, strewn as it was with thousands of colourful and distracting objects. After a couple of minutes, accompanied by the jarring melodies of the pianist, I came upon the spot I believed Linda had alluded to, a cramped aisle enclosed by bookshelves. I paused at the mouth of this passage, spotting a figure at the opposite end, a short woman in a plain beige dress, passing through a door on the far wall. I went after her immediately, my strides in time with the honky-tonk. I stepped through the open portal and closed it carefully behind me. My first thought was that I'd followed a member of staff into a storage area of some sort. The space was essentially a long corridor, housing a variety of cardboard boxes, and what appeared to be dozens of items of furniture protected by dust sheets. The corridor was dimly lit, revealing no trace of the diminutive figure I'd trailed. The muted tones of the honky-tonk faintly reached my ears, but other than that, all was eerily quiet. And though there wasn't a soul in sight, I sensed that I wasn't alone. "Hello?" I called into the gloom, but there was no reply, and I wasn't a fan of the way the shadowy space swallowed the word. A moment of contemplation followed, in which the need for a cigarette almost crippled me, but I mastered the craving and focused on the task at hand. Was there something here I wasn't supposed to see? The woman I'd followed looked just like Linda. Was she the double I sought? The very thing accountable for the presence of my own dubious twin? Undeterred, I went about my business in that murky passageway, opening boxes and peeking under dust sheets, all the while mindful of the invisible eyes watching me. If there was something with me in the gloom, it was reluctant to reveal itself, sticking like glue to the darkest recesses. Deeper and deeper I penetrated into that windowless lair, unveiling valuable china and elaborate cutlery, towering wardrobes and gargantuan dresses, until at last I happened upon something of real significance. The object in question was a large, plain, rectangular mirror, standing a good foot or two taller than me at roughly 8 feet. Partially revealed beneath the dust sheet, it struck me how the mirror, in a quite extraordinary manner, resembled a door. Perhaps it had once been affixed to a door, in order to conceal it. Perchance a door in a large house with many rooms. It was impossible to say. The dim light above my head, one of many flickering fluorescent tubes, intermittently revealed my reflection in various states of illumination, and I didn't like what I saw there. Was I really so austere, so dark, for want of a better word? I could have sworn that the black eyes that gazed back at me were not my own. It was hypnotizing, that look. I fell into a stupor for several moments. No, I didn't like it one bit. I replaced the dust sheet and retreated, shuddering. The time had come to make some inquiries. Returning to music memorabilia, I was pleased to discover that the young man had vacated his seat at the piano. I retraced my steps, following the arrows in reverse, and rediscovered the entrance hall. I was on the lookout for a member of staff, anybody who might be able to answer a few questions concerning the curious looking-glass in the storage area. But it was with a growing sense of unease that I realized nobody was about. I hadn't seen a single person on my journey back to the entrance hall, and, worryingly, the large double doors marking the entrance itself were now closed, and, following several attempts to pull them open, were apparently locked. I scratched my chin nervously, lost in my thoughts, but I was quickly snapped out of my contemplations by the sound of footsteps above my head. So off I went, mounting the stairs as before, scanning the room with the 5 arches for signs of life. But whoever had been on the prowl up there had apparently moved on. I went to the cafe, in search of the polite young fellow who had prepared that fresh pot of English breakfast for Linda and me, but he too was nowhere to be seen. The cafe was empty, closed ostensibly, and it was there in the silent tea-room that I realized it was dark outside. As a matter of fact, it was impossible to see anything beyond the black windows, as though the world without just wasn't there. At this juncture, fraught with the strangeness of it all, I succumbed to my compulsion, and withdrew a cigarette, lighting it with fervor. I just needed a distraction, a moment or two to think. Can I remind you of what I said earlier, about stepping into another world, but not literally? Well, no, I didn't experience that again, but the memory of walking into that chamber of pungent Afghans came flooding back to me, and so, consuming the cigarette in a record 3 breaths, I went off in search of the rug section. Like the maze I yet again found myself traversing, the events of the day had become a tangled mesh that made absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. And, as a result, just as before, I had no choice but to forge ahead on impulse. And as I went, passing the globes and the comic books, the curious verses of the man who followed himself doing laps in my head, I couldn't shake the impression that it was I who was being followed, my pursuer gaining on me with every step, with every wrong turn, with every crowded dead end from which I was forced to retreat. Finally, I reached my destination, and ducked under the arch into the rug section. On tiptoes, I crept along the parquet floor, looking for a suitable niche to climb into. I found such an alcove, within the open arms of a large display rack. I accepted the embrace of the sweet-smelling carpets on either side of me, and waited there, like a cautious chameleon. The wait was soon over. Into the chamber came the sound of footsteps, heavy, booted steps, akin to my own. I resisted the urge to take a peek, willing the stranger to move further into the section. I could sense the hesitation of the figure on the threshold, knowing somehow that this person was divided on the subject of pursuit. For it was, as you've probably already guessed, reader, myself that stood there, analyzing the carpets and inhaling the odors, seeking me. And as he spun on his heel and retreated, as I knew he eventually would, the words of the man who followed himself came to me again. On he strode with great aplomb, his flame it burned anew. Insensible of the true design, he must exist as two. Confirmation of the fact. My dabble and I were indeed one and the same. Myself, my own decoy. Boggles the mind, doesn't it? And the purpose of the illusion, for illusion it must have been, was to lead me on a wild goose chase, while the entity from elsewhere continued its search for that which it so desperately wanted. I emerged from my hiding place, and went after myself, trailing at a discreet distance. What a surreal experience, matching pace with oneself through a deserted maze, like a ghost in an empty world, whose vision allows for the sight of his living self, and no other. Down the stairs we plunged, and through the entrance hall we went, following the arrows as before. Like a shadow, I lingered in the corner of music memorabilia, watched as I went about my business, saw the keys of the honky-tonk moving up and down of their own volition, hearing not a sound, seeing nothing of the young pianist. But I did see the doppelganger, Linda's double, saw it materialize before my watchful eye, drawn to the book-lined aisle, something small and square clutched in its reproduction hand. And as my look-alike, bold as brass, went in the same direction, I followed. But something was different. Where before there had been a door at the end of the aisle, there was now a small black opening, beyond which nothing could be seen. The doppelganger was gone, as was my double, but in that moment I simply didn't care. I was drawn to the darkness, and without fear or hesitation, I approached the opening and stepped into it. I was back in the storage area, a version of it anyway. The cardboard boxes had disappeared, along with the dust sheets, revealing all that had been previously covered, the wardrobes and dressers, sideboards and bookcases. Gone were the fluorescent tubes overhead, replaced by an endless row of suspended pendant lights, fading into oblivion in both directions, and much dimmer than their predecessors. Immediately, I took off walking, guided by the handful of familiar furniture items I'd formerly examined. I was on the lookout for the curious mirror. There was something remarkable about that looking-glass, and I was eager to see it again, to probe its depths, learn its secrets, perhaps. Ahead of me, lumbering along the murky passage, was the outline of the doppelganger, Linda's doppelganger, a silhouette that seemed to be changing shape as it went. In the dull glow afforded by the lights above, the figure seemed to assume the form of something spherical. The legs disappeared, the arms contracted, and the head collapsed into the torso. In the end, all that remained was a globular mass that appeared to glide rather than roll. Baffled by this bizarre transformation, I kept my distance, despite the fact that I knew the thing was aware of my presence, just as it had been earlier on my first visit to that strange place. And when moments later it stopped, I stopped too, wondering what it would do next. I saw that the thing had reached the mirror and was gliding towards it, holding in its truncated flat hand the item it had plucked from the arcade, an object I was still unable to get a proper look at. Bear with me here, reader, but this part is difficult to explain. Imagine, if you will, a great soap bubble blown into the air, floating there for several seconds, and, rather than falling to the ground and bursting, the bubble glides along horizontally, and attaches itself to a vast panel of glass. And then it begins to shrink rapidly, as though the air within is being sucked out of it. This is precisely what I saw in that shadowy corridor. The curious mirror apparently consumed the strange shape. Hesitantly, I approached the looking-glass and stood before it, eyeing my reflection suspiciously, frowning at the weird visage that met my gaze, distorted by what appeared to be a membranous layer of fluid clinging to its surface. I don't know why I did it, but I couldn't help myself. I reached out and meant to touch the surface, when, with hideous abruptness, the ghostly arms of my distorted reflection emerged from the mirror, like the flailing limbs of a drowning man clutching at the air above him. I recoiled mechanically and let out a shrill cry as my reflection lunged forward, its face but a white mask, its translucent hands clutching frantically. I took off at a run, and I didn't look back. I'll never know whether or not that thing gave chase, for although no pursuing footsteps were heard, it might very well have adopted its true form in order to glide towards me silently. Either way, I outran it, plunging headlong some minutes later into the black portal that had transported me to that awful place. The transition was instant. I was standing in music memorabilia, in the bosom of the cramped aisle, the spines of 1,000 books surrounding me. The tuneless din of the honky-tonk filled the air, which was music to my ears. Excuse the pun. I turned and saw not a door, nor a dark maw, but another bookshelf filled with biographies and volumes pertaining to music theory. For the last time, I returned to the entrance hall and penned a short note for Linda, to be put aside for her to find on the morrow. It was a simple explanation of what had occurred, with emphasis on the fact that whatever it was that had been roaming the Royal Arcade had found what it was looking for, and had, presumably, returned to wherever it had come from. Not my best work, but it was an uncanny afternoon, which, in truth, left me with more questions than answers. And speaking of questions, I've raised a few here that need to be addressed. So, what is a doppelganger? Could it be that these things are simply shapeshifters that adopt the guise of certain individuals in order to conduct their enigmatic affairs with impunity? Well, let's go with that for now. What do they want? Well, in this case, without knowing what the item was that Linda's double recovered, it's impossible to say what it wanted. Perhaps we'll come back to this one at a later date. But there's another question, one that might be easier to answer than the others. Where do they come from? The answer, I believe, is in that looking-glass, the mirror that resembled a door, hidden away in that dark storage area. I made inquiries afterwards, only to discover that no such storage area exists in the Royal Arcade. But I've read of such a mirror before, in that most interesting of books, Bold Evocations, by our old friend Thomas Carnacki. Keep your eyes peeled, reader. I expect to head further north in the near future, to advance my investigations into the question, what is a doppelganger? Afterword. Well, I think that's everything. Such a difficult case to reflect upon. Poor choice of words, really. I've been uncomfortable in front of the mirror these last few weeks. I've had doubts about the image that glares back at me. Certain things just get under one's skin, I suppose. It's okay. I'll recover. I always do. I've kept in touch with Linda. Since my visit, no further sightings have been reported. Nothing out of the ordinary. But that's because the thing has moved on, gone back to the other side, and it's taken its spoils with it. What was it that the doppelganger retrieved from the arcade? Well, I have Linda to thank for providing the answer. It turns out that something small and square was unaccounted for when Linda returned to the arcade the day after my visit. An anonymous-looking jewelry box containing a silver locket. This locket, Linda tells me, once belonged to a member of the Montague family, proprietors of Montague Castle, near Ravenglass, Cumbria. I've chosen to leave this bit of information out of the article, as I'm not sure what it means. The plot thickens. For further answers, I'll need to head up to Ravenglass, but I don't think I'm ready for that. Not yet. Peter Van Melsen, Rosedale, February 2011.
If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,